was 67 years ago today, virtually to the minute, October the 15th, 1940, that Horst Hellriegel, flying a Messerschmitt 109, this is a model very similar, crash landed here and then eventually walked down to the main road to hitch a lift. In 1940, this area at the top of Bowcombe Down near Carisbrooke on the Isle of Wight was uncultivated. It was mostly tufted grass with some gorse bushes. Feldwebel Hellriegel tried to make a Willesdown landing, but the 109's undercarriage collapsed at the end of its run. One of its underwing radiator air scoops was torn off. This artefact was passed on to me in later years by the boy who rescued it. In those wartime days, the craze of most youngsters was to collect souvenirs, which were mainly pieces of shrapnel from anti-aircraft shells. One can imagine the delight of Keith and Graham Barnes, who were first to discover the abandoned aircraft, a whole Messerschmitt. The engine was still quite hot and creaked as it cooled. Young Graham climbed into the cockpit and fiddled with the controls, which included the gun trigger. Meanwhile, his brother was peering down the barrel of one of the wing cannons. Fortunately, Hellriegel had deactivated the guns. The pilot, meanwhile, had strolled down to the road. Now here the story gets a little hazy. Some have said that he walked into the Betty Haunt pub, now known as the Blacksmith's Arms. Another version states that he was taken to the Waverley pub at Carisbrooke. It is certainly known that he was picked up by 17-year-old Harold Blow, who was driving a lorry. So startled was Harold when he discovered that he had stopped for a German airman, he stalled the truck's engine several times. Each time, Horst Hellriegel politely jumped out and cranked the engine back to life. Now what to do with the German? Harold decided to go straight to the local policeman's home, which was quite nearby. The policeman was not at home, but Mrs. Policeman was. She took one look at the German standing there in his Luftwaffe flying suit and, oh my God, slammed the door in his face. So what could Harold do? The best thing now was to go home to Mum. The Blow family lived in Gunville, which is virtually part of Carisbrooke. It was around lunchtime and Mrs. Blow was preparing Dad's dinner. He was out at the time. As soon as she saw her unexpected guest, she took control. She had a big kitchen knife. The pilot was made to sit down, and soon it was established that he was no threat. The German, who spoke perfect English, was amazed that the so-called starving British had meat. Well, he had some continental chocolate with him, and an understanding was reached. In return for the confectionery, Hellriegel ate Dad's dinner. While all this was taking place, the younger Blow children, who had been pretty impressed by the visitor, had been sent out to get the authorities. Very soon a jostle of soldiers burst in, guns with fixed bayonets at the ready. The moment was tense. Then Mrs. Blow rose to her full height and stood between the soldiers and her guest, declaring that the man was harmless and that he had already surrendered to her. Hellriegel went quietly into captivity, but that wasn't quite the end of the matter. A national newspaper heard of the story and published a report which castigated Mrs. Blow for feeding the enemy. The lady wasn't at all put out, but she was absolutely furious when she read that she had been described as a large, buxom woman. The authorities now made a big mistake. They intended exhibiting the Messerschmitt 109 to gather money for the Spitfire Fund, but they failed to put a guard on it. Word of such a bounty soon spread throughout the island's youth, and very soon gangs of boys made their way to the crash site. Hacksaws, axes, hammers and wrecking bars were used to prize away the great collector's treasures. It didn't take long for the aeroplane to be reduced to a pile of junk. George and Albert Eason were 13-year-old twins. They carried off the entire nose cowling. One of the wing cannons was taken by a local Home Guard crew who set it up in a quarry to test it. An armourer sergeant lost an eye when a shell he was hacksawing in half for demonstration purposes exploded. Now the police became involved, somewhat a little too late. One officer had heard that the Eason twins had taken part in the feeding frenzy. He visited their home and was told by Mrs. Eason that her children probably had a small piece tucked away behind the garden shed. The policeman had a look and returned to the front door, cap in hand, with a dazed expression on his face. "Blimey, missus, I thought they might have a little bit, but not half the bloody aeroplane." The boys escaped with a ticking off. Even 60 years later, when interviewed, Albert still wanted to find out who'd snitched on them. Other kids were not so lucky. Many were rounded up and taken to court, fined, and their treasures confiscated. However, this led to a lot of the liberated aircraft pieces being hidden away. In recent years, I have managed to locate certain items, such as the underwing air scoop already mentioned. Also a piece of doped fabric from an aileron, one of the propeller blades, and even a swastika from the 109's tail fin. This latter item was removed by Tiffy Burden and is now owned by his grandson. I have heard that the plane's rudder was destroyed when the shed in which it had been concealed was demolished, but the best secret of all was that of an entire wing. It was carried off by a group of boys. They got frightened when they heard the police were closing in and buried it under a chicken run. Apparently it's still there, but the garden has been given a complete makeover with patios, fountains and a pergola. Well, we can still dream. It's worth noting that the aircraft that Hell Regal was flying that day was not his usual one. His had been withdrawn for repair. This, Yellow 8, was normally flown by a veteran of the Condor Legion, that is, one of the elite who had seen action in Spain prior to the Second World War. In fact, the Mickey Mouse motif below the aeroplane's cockpit denoted this, and as such was highly prized. Too bad this wasn't taken as a souvenir, or perhaps it was. Horst Hell Regal, flying a Messerschmitt 109 E4, number 1588, was shot down by 2 RAF pilots. Pilot Officer Agazarian of 609 Squadron and Pilot Officer Vlasnovolsky of 213 Squadron. Neither survived the war. Feldwebel Hell Regal became a prisoner of war. Oh, and that underwing air scoop now hangs on the wall of the Isle of Wight Military History Museum near Cowes on the Isle of Wight.